make absolutely clear that even when you compare two economies of the same size, it's still going to make sense for the poorer economy to trade with the other economy, despite not being as productive in any of the sectors in question. So how do you make that assumption that the foreign economy is less productive than the home economy? It's very simple. Given that the A's reflect the number of hours needed to produce one unit of F, you just make these A's higher. So in this case, asterisk stands for foreign. I have made AC and AF greater than the corresponding asterisk values. So that means that I'm assuming home is less productive in producing C as well as F. Yeah? So let's call home Britain, let's call foreign France. You know, countries with similar populations. Yeah? So in this case, we're saying that for whatever reason, the French are just better producing C as well as F. So they just need fewer hours. Yeah? So this already reflects an advantage, and we call it an absolute advantage. Yeah? If I need fewer hours of work to produce one C and one F in France compared to the UK, then we have a higher productivity, we are better. Yeah? And that's reflected in an absolute advantage. Yeah? So what would happen? This is of course not true, but in this case, the French economy would be far, far greater than the British economy despite the same population. So the L is the same, but because you're using the same number of workers to produce output with different productivity, may well be that you're able to produce a lot more in France. And that's precisely what we're getting in this case. The assumption was, if you look at compare the maximum amount you could produce of each good, the assumption here is that you need half of the number of people needed in the UK to produce 1 unit of cloth here, so that's why this is double this, and you only need 1/3 when it comes to food, so this value here is 3 times as big as that one. Yeah. So not too surprisingly, so this was the assumption. In foreign France, you need half as many workers as in the UK to produce 1 unit of C, and 1/3 of the workers in order to produce F. And so your production possibility frontier is much further to the right than in the case of home. Yeah? But what matters really is not absolute advantage, but so-called comparative advantage. And that comparative advantage is going to be measured by this ratio of productivities, or the opportunity cost. It's all very well to say that France is better at producing both goods, but clearly France is relatively better at producing F than C. Why? Because its advantage over the UK is bigger for the food sector than it is for the cloth sector. Here, its productivity is sort of twice as big. In here, it's 3 times as big. That's why it only needs 1/3 of the workers. So how do you see that in terms of the diagram? Well, as you can see, even though this production possibility in frontier for foreign is much further to the right than it is for home, the slope is different, and the slope reflects this different relative productivities. Yeah? So that's why it's going to make a lot of sense for France to tend to specialise. In this case, we will go for complete specialisation, but you don't need to tend to specialise in the production of food. Yeah? And so these gains from specialisation in trade arise simply because of different relative productivity. As we saw, by construction, we have assumed that home has an absolute disadvantage in producing all the goods, cloth and food in our case. It's still going to make sense to trade. Yeah? So what's going to happen? Well, of course, people will now, if you open the economy to trade, people will now be able to buy from any country. And ignoring transportation costs, people are going to buy from the country that is able to sell for the lower price. But prices, as you know, are going to reflect costs. So what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be changes of people across sectors, and in the new equilibrium, there's going to be a price for cloth, a price for food, and people will only be buying from the lowest price producer. So when there's perfect specialization, which is the example I'll give you here, this means that one country is going to be the sole producer of one good, and the other country will then have specialized in the other good. Yeah? So, as before, now let's go for the details. So, as before, it's still the case that the relative price is simply the price of one good over the price of the other. And prices are in the order key going to reflect simply productivity. Yeah? When you open the economy to trade, what matters is going to be that because there are different opportunity costs of producing one good in terms of the other, there will also be different relative prices. And as you can see from here, foreign is going to have, despite being better than home at producing both goods, it's going to have a relative price of cloth that is higher than home. And why is that? Because even though foreign, remember that our example France is twice as better than home at producing cloth, it's 3 times as better as producing food. Yeah. So yes, they're better at producing both, but they are only relatively better at producing one of the goods. Yeah. So this means that the opportunity cost of cloth in terms of food is going to be greater for foreign than it is for home, and this is what gives rise to trading opportunities. And so when they trade, of course, the new price will have to be between the two water key prices. And so the notation here is the P subscript capital T is the equilibrium price with trade. So you allow people to produce from any sector they want. You allow consumers to buy from any country, and there's going to be an equilibrium, and the relative price of cloth in terms of food is going to now be between the two water key prices. Yeah, not too surprisingly. It's going to be above the relative price of home. Yeah. So home has specialised in cloth making. I'm kind of repeating myself. It's effectively because even though it has a disadvantage in absolute terms in both sectors, its disadvantage in the cloth industry is less big than the food industry. Yeah? And so this means, this is the details, I mean the algebra is absolutely straightforward. So prices are going to reflect cost or margin of cloth. Because the price of the relative price of cloth after trade is going to rise, then workers would be at home, would be after trade making more money in the cloth sector than they would in the food sector. And because of that, no worker will be willing to be engaged in the food sector. Yeah, of course, in a model where you have firms as well, what we're really saying is that now people have realised that they can make more money by switching to the cloth industry. And so they would. Of course, this never happens overnight, but it would, this, over time, that's what we would get. And so what we're focusing here is in the sort of long run. Once you have all the possible adjustments, then one would have expected this society home to have moved towards the specialization in cloth production, and now it would no longer be producing F, it would be importing all of it from foreign. Yeah? And of course, when you have countries of similar sizes, it's perfectly possible for there to be complete specialization in the foreign country as well. In more general terms, whether or not you're going to get complete specialization typically depends on the size of your economy compared to the other economy. So, for example, if you can only get a particular type of products from one or two countries, and you're a big economy, you're the US with China, and you're trading with that, and you acknowledge that you have a disadvantage, relative disadvantage in producing a particular goods, then you will want to import as much as possible from the other countries. But because they're small countries, it may well be that they will not be able to supply what you need. So they will be able to supply 80% of your demand, but not the 100%. So the big economy will then also have to produce some of it. So the more general lesson here is that when you have economies that have very different sizes, with trade, there's going to be a trend or tendency towards specialization, but often that specialization is not complete. Yeah, and it has to be because the demand for products in one of the economies is so big that even if the other economy were to specialize in producing just for that economy, it would still not be enough. Yeah? And again, if you think about big economies trading with small economies, small islands, and so on, this makes a lot of sense. Right, so why does foreign specialise in food production? Well, it's going to be exactly the same idea. It's going to end up by specialising in food production because prices are going to reflect marginal costs, and in this case it happens that as the price after trade, the relative price of cloth after trade is going to change, decrease, the equilibrium wage in the foreign economy, in the food sector, would now be higher than it is in the cloth sector, and because of that, it makes sense for workers, more generally workers and firms, to switch to that sector. So a nice way of looking at this stuff is by using just a diagram that reflects, rather than having two diagrams where you have the supply and demand for the two products. So you have world demand for cloth and world supply of cloth, and then world demand for food and world supply of food, so two markets. We now think in terms of a relative demand and relative supply of the two goods. And the nice thing about it is that you can have, in one diagram, you can look at the equilibrium. Yeah? So that's what we're going to do here, and it's a standard diagram, and I'm sure it's also in the basic textbook. So first thing we look at is this idea of the world relative supply of cloth. And so it's a relative supply because it's going to be the total supply of one good, in this case cloth, over the total supply of food. Yeah? And so what we're saying here is that the relative supply of cloth is going to be given by the ratio of the total amount of cloth produced by home plus the total amount of cloth produced by foreign divided by the equivalent numbers for the food sector. Yeah?